Introduction: How to stop an addiction. By understanding the brain structure of pleasure, you will be able to better understand how we find pleasure in an activity and why we may fall into an addiction. In this book, you will learn: how do we find pleasure in an activity? How can we become addicted to a substance? How can we become obese despite ourselves? What is the difference between love and sex in our sense of pleasure? How can we become addicted to gambling? How can we activate the pleasure circuit with a healthy habit? Our answers to these questions are easy to understand, simple to implement, and quick to execute. Ready to stop an addiction? Let's go. How do we find pleasurable activity? Whether you have an orgasm, eat a chocolate, or smoke a cigarette, pleasurable activities all have one thing in common: they activate the pleasure circuit in the brain. This pleasure circuit releases dopamine. This pleasure hormone goes to the amygdala, which controls our emotions, and to the dorsal striatum, which is responsible for learning habits. So when you do an activity, if you enjoy it, you will remember it and want to repeat it. How can you become addicted to a substance? Earlier, we saw that all pleasurable activities activate the pleasure circuit. However, some activities produce more intense pleasure than others, which makes them more addictive. For example, we are more likely to become addicted to heroin than to cigarettes, because they produce more pleasure. And yet, in reality, more people are addicted to cigarettes than to heroin. Other factors that influence whether you are addicted to a substance include ease of access, the attitude of your peers toward it, and the rituals surrounding it. For example, people are more addicted to cigarettes because they are legal, more accepted by society and those around you than heroin. But that's not all. The more the action is repeated over time, the more we become accustomed to doing that action and thus fall into the addiction. For example, people are more addicted to cigarettes because they are consumed several times a day compared to heroin. A tip: to stop an addiction, it is important to associate a negative experience rather than happy moments with a substance. For example, to avoid drinking alcohol in excess, think of the hangover you will have rather than the pleasure of being drunk. How can we become obese despite ourselves? In our brain, we have an appetite management system. When we eat, the level of leptin, a hormone produced by fat cells, increases. And when a certain level of leptin is reached, it suppresses appetite and increases energy expenditure. But people who suffer from obesity tend to resist leptin. This means that despite the leptin level reached, it does not suppress appetite. And at the same time, eating causes the release of dopamine, which leads to an irresistible urge to continue eating more fat, salt, and sugar. This causes a vicious cycle of eating more food and therefore weight gain and increased leptin resistance. What is the difference between love and sex in our sense of pleasure? Falling in love and orgasm activate the pleasure circuit in different ways. Falling in love deactivates our judgment, which is why we think that the person we love is the best, the most beautiful, and the most intelligent. In this case, the release of dopamine is activated in a diffuse way when we see the loved one. Orgasm is an emotional and sensory experience that can be experienced without pleasure. For example, an orgasm can be induced with electrodes and causes a physiological response but does not activate the pleasure circuit. In this case, if there is sexual excitement, then the orgasm causes a more intense release of dopamine than in the previous case. How can one become addicted to gambling? The definition of an addiction is that an activity is repeated compulsively with increasingly negative consequences for the person. In gambling, what gives us the most pleasure is not winning but the uncertainty of winning. As a result, gambling changes the pleasure circuit and causes us to play increasingly uncertain games, even if we lose huge amounts of money. In addition, gambling addiction is also partly hereditary. How to activate the pleasure circuit with a healthy habit? The pleasure circuit is also activated when we engage in healthy activities. When we exercise, physical pain causes us to release opioids, endocannabinoids, and dopamine, which gives us pleasure. Being altruistic by giving to charity gives as much pleasure as receiving money. Finally, simply learning for the sake of learning also leads to a release of dopamine. Conclusion: there are a number of unhealthy activities that we can become addicted to because they are enjoyable. Fortunately, there are also healthy activities that do not cause damage in our lives and activate our pleasure circuits in the same way, such as sports, giving, or learning. If you like the summary, click on one of our partner links to discover the compass of pleasure. How our brains make fatty foods: orgasm, exercise, marijuana, generosity, vodka, learning, and gambling feel so good by David J. Linden in ebook, book, or audiobook format. And if you're not interested in reading further, we recommend you discover The Molecule of More: How a Single Chemical in Your Brain Drives Love, Sex, and Creativity, and Will Determine the Fate of the Human Race by Daniel Z. Lieberman, Michael E. Long. Introduction: How to Be Happier. A single molecule governs all facets of your life. Dopamine is a miracle molecule that has extraordinary effects on your thoughts and behavior. By understanding its role, you will be able to become happier. In this book, you will learn: how is dopamine created? How does dopamine make us crazy in love? Why is it hard to stop using drugs? How can our brain counteract dopamine? How is dopamine one of the causes of schizophrenia? How does dopamine influence your political beliefs? How can you be fully happy with dopamine? Our answers to these questions are easy to understand, simple to implement, and quick to execute. Ready to be happier? Let's go.